All right. Well, welcome to another video. And I know it's been a long time, but somebody had written in that they would like more information on what differentiates traditional Japanese steel from other kinds of steel used in Japanese sword forging, how all of that differs, what it matters, how they differ, etc. So we can start with the term Tamahagane, which, if you're watching this video, you've probably heard that term before because I would think you're into, Japanese swords and things like this. It refers to the traditional steel used in and the traditional steel making process used in Japanese swords. And for the longest time, from the start of Japanese sword making, smiths had created their own steel in their own forges and then forged their swords from that. And then later, more towards the Edo period, but probably a little before that too, there were more so regional tatara, these big forges set up to provide steel throughout the different areas of Japan regionally. It was certainly more cost and time effective to do that, and the demand was there. So, and these tatara that were regional could also be much larger than a smith's private forge, which could only be so big. These regional tatara could be really huge. And the process consisted of whether the smith was making their own steel or the regional tatara were making the steel. The process consisted of really starting with a low quality base material, iron sand, I think it's like a blackish iron sand. And what they would do is, whether it's the small Smith's Tatara, relatively small, or the much larger regional Tatara, and they would start with a lot of charcoal and a lot of the iron sand and bellows, and they'd heat it up as hot as they can get it for. I know in the regional Tatara, and I've seen a video on this. It's somewhere out there on eBay. I mean, not eBay. Sorry, YouTube. You could look that up. And it's really fascinating because I think it was over a period of at least days, maybe longer, is they just kept pouring charcoal and sand in. And at the end, after, like I said, at least several days, they get these hooks. They tear apart the tatara because the walls are just made of clay, and they tear it apart. And at the bottom, they have these pieces of the Tamahagane, the traditional steel. But there are different grades ranging from a lower quality to a higher quality, and they box this up in boxes that denote the quality of the steel to offer to, of course, for sale to the swordsmiths in the area. And the tatara operators and the smiths can tell after a lot of experience from just the color of the steel what's a higher quality and what's not, like what's medium grade, lower grade, etc. And that was the traditional way Japanese swords were made, really, until let's say early 1900s, when the Japanese military realized, oh, we can't provide these like thousands of swords to officers, because as the Japanese military expanded, so did their officer corps, naturally. And it was a requirement that each Japanese officer have their own Japanese sword. And starting early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, you'll see a mix of different kinds of swords, a big mix. And that big mix really expanded until the end of World War II, where there were some traditional, made with Tamahagane Japanese swords carried into battle by officers. And there were also some that were various levels of machine made. When I say machine made, some of them were wholly stamped out from big presses. Like it was like how you make car parts, the car panels. And sometimes they would be partly made like that, but partly finished by hand. And but any of those would be made out of mill steel or old railway lines because of efficiency. I mean, they had to think practically, especially as the military expanded and their wars and interventions expanded, especially into China and other areas in Asia. Uh, they had to use cost-effective measures, and each officer had to buy his own sword. So, and the military did have a program where they would take in traditionally made swords that were, I forget, either like volunteered or sold for that effort, but the military would exclude those with any significant value. They would sometimes get these swords in that they would just have to refuse and be like, no, this is really, we're bringing this into battle here. This is really too expensive. If you want, sell it, hold on to it, donate it to a shrine, whatever, but we can't accept that. So the chances of you finding a traditional sword in military mounts that's like hugely rare and expensive, that's another reason why the chances are so thin, because the military wasn't about to do that, and most owners, especially they're going into a battlefield, weren't about to do that. And the other thing to consider is the just a significant use of that mill steel throughout the war, and how prized and rare the use of Tamahagane was. But I don't want to also give people the, all right, I would dare to say, false illusion that Tamahagane is this like magical, wonderful material, because it could vary widely, especially before the advent and production of these regional tatara. It was up to the smith to make their own Tamahagane. So just as the skill of the smith could vary widely, so did their skill in refining and really making the steel. And like I said before, the process of making Tamahagane was not just art for art's sake. It was developed as a necessity because they were starting with this really inferior quality raw material. It was a crummy raw material. That's why a lot of people, who make swords now, not the traditionally made swords, you really could make something that could rival the strength and, resilience of an old sword by making it much simpler, because you're already starting with, whether you start with a Swedish powdered steel or 1095, you're starting with really a much higher quality steel to begin with. Tamahagane is great, but it has its limit. It's not legendary. It's not like this super material. But it does, using Tamahagane and the forging folding process and quenching in water, that matters. It does enable you to see a lot more detail than using not doing the forging folding process and tempering in oil. But from what I've seen, if you start, whether you start with Tamahagane or you start with the mill steel or powdered steel, if you do the traditional Japanese forging folding process and you water temper the blade, I haven't seen there really be much of it. I can tell the difference between using Tamahagane and regular steel if you're going through all those other subsequent steps. I don't know of anybody else who can either. If you can, write in. Or post examples, please. Because I'm going to show examples here, and I'll take them apart and show you what I've been talking about. So you take something like this. This is a traditional antique katana. It's in great shape, and it's very nice. And this has a blade made from Tamahagane steel. And I'm going to pull this out, and you'll see the grain, the pattern, and again, we separate the sword from the scabbard very carefully along the mune back here. Notice how I'm not touching the blade. I'm going to go get something to support this blade. So a regular napkin should suffice. I'm not wiping the thing down vigorously at all with anything. So I'm just going to be primarily supporting the mune anyway. So if you'll notice, I'm trying to avoid glare here, sorry, that there is a temper line and there's a temper pattern along the hamon, and you might be able to see grain if I hold it up close. I don't know. It's not a fantastic polish, but it's pretty good. So there's that. You can see what the boshi is. I don't know, I'm going kind of fast there, sorry. But you can almost see grain there, right? A little bit better. And you can see activity within the hamon. See some undulations. And if a blade is oil quenched, you just tend not to see that much activity. You don't. It'll still have a temper line if it's been tempered in oil, but it'll be relatively free of activity versus a water quench blade. The reason why people oil quench, and they did in World War II for a lot of the mill steel blades, is because there's far less risk of cracking. Tempering in oil. There's a greater risk tempering in water, and they wanted to maximize production, so they really didn't want to take the risk of, you go through all this effort to make a blade, you only find out the last second when you go to quench it and you tink, or, and then you realize, oh, the whole thing is, toast. So the swords tempered in oil, the blades tempered in oil, whatever they were made of, would be really, just as useful and not as pretty, but just as useful and effective. So, like I said, less prone to cracking. So what we're going to do here, see, I put out the pin with this, my little brass hammer. This is one of my favorite tools. It's a great tool. It comes apart. And we're going to remove this section by section, and I'll show you how we do this. Sometimes you have to use a little bit more force, but whenever I can, I just like to do this. Grip, and if you just squeeze, like tighten your grip, it should come apart a little bit more. It's a whole lot safer, especially than having a blade in your hand or anywhere else and yanking this apart. When it comes to Japanese swords, don't yank anything. If you gotta yank a sword out of the scabbard, stop. Something is amiss. Go slow. Think about it. Take your time. So, take this off, and I try to keep these all together. Sometimes these were put together in a certain order for a reason. These seppa, and then what happens when you go and mix up the order is they don't really fit on quite right. And you're like, what the heck is going on here? What is this? And you mix up the order of the seppa. Try to keep them in the same order. And next, I'm going to take off the habaki. The habaki is another one. If it's tight, what I try to do is put the blade up like this, pull it down. Again, supporting, don't touch it with your bare hands, please, because the acids from your fingers, if they're not going to rot through it now, they will over time. So pull it down. Maybe shake it a little bit. All right, that's as far as I want to go with this. I am not going any further. Sorry. I'm not forcing it. But this sword has been shortened. I think Suriage, because if I move the habaki up again, you can tell pretty much where, at what point it was shortened years ago. Looks like here. See, I'll move it back a little bit. Probably the original hole is here. The new hole is here. Unless it has been shortened before this and there was another hole here. I don't know that. So, sorry. So this sword started out a little thicker, as you can see, but not much. So, and this sword was made in the traditional way. And you can put these back on here. Let's put these back together. And sometimes you can even see from there, I don't know if you can on here, where the core steel separates from the skin steel. You can almost see it. I'm sorry if you're looking at this and you really can't see it, but I can a little bit here. Because the most common manufacturing method for antique Japanese swords was to have the two kinds of steel. You have a core steel, and then you have like a skin steel. The core steel is a little softer and enables it to take a shock a little bit better. And the outer steel is harder. It's better for taking that edge. So especially after it's been tempered. And sometimes you look at the end there, you can tell the core steel and steel. I mean, the other way is if you have a sword cross section, you slice in half and polish it. I don't recommend doing that unless maybe if it's already in pieces. I've seen that done. I've seen examples of that. It's interesting, but don't ruin your antique blade. So again, we're going to make sure none of our skin has touched this. Right? Before we put it away, I'm going to try to show detail again and activity in the hamon. Again, even this much activity, which is not a whole ton, you wouldn't see a lot of that in an oil-tempered blade. But next I'm going to show one that's a star stamp Gendaito. And how that is different is this was made during the World War II era. It was made during World War II time period, but with Tamahagane and water quenched, forged, folded with Tamahagane in the traditional method. And that star on the tang denotes that. It's an army acceptance stamp for Rikugun Jometosho smiths who were given, like kind of an allowance, a certain amount of Tamahagane from which to make traditional Japanese swords for the Japanese army, for officers. I would only guess that these swords sold at a premium compared to swords that were oil quenched or made from mill steel, or oil quenched and made from mill steel, because there's certainly more time and effort went into this. And you should be able to tell right away that there's a lot of activity in this hamon too that you just won't see from a more like mass-produced mill steel blade. And I have in the past also used that term kind of interchangeably with showato. Really, a showato is any sword made in the Showa era. But when people use that term, a lot of times when I use that term, we're not talking about the traditionally made swords. We're talking about swords that were in some way mass-produced, maybe made of mill steel, oil quenched, not forged and folded, all of those, two of those, one of those. So the term Gendaito is used to describe a sword like this. Made in, in the Showa era, you could say, or around the world, more so around the World War II era time period, but using traditional methods. So, like I said, forged, folded, water tempered. And I'll try to show you some of the detail of this as well. There's actually quite a bit of detail in this sword. I'm just doing my best to try to show you. Oh, that was a hair. So, let me see. I'm going to go slow, but not too slow. There's detail there. I'm working on a better way to try to show this detail in the future. So if anybody knows a method, let me know. I'll turn it there. Maybe that's better. Yeah, I think that's a little better, actually. Sorry you got to stare at my face at the same time. But see, there's a lot of activity there where you're just not going to have that most times in anything that's oil tempered. Oil doesn't let you bring out the detail of something that's water tempered. And this, I don't know if you're going to see too much of a grain here. This is more of a tighter grain sword, but the state of polish is actually very good. And we'll take this handle off, and I'll show, again, we'll go through the process of that, and I'll show you the star stamp and the signature and date. Well, that came out pretty easily. It's a little scary, but all right. So again, when I first began studying this traditional process, is do this, and you hit your wrist till it pops out. With a lot of these swords, that part's not really necessary. Usually, I can wiggle this a little bit. See, it's loose already. I take it here, just squeeze, and it's off. Because a lot of times the wood has also shrunk over the past, what's it been, 75, 80 years? And it's not as tight as it used to be. Again, trying to keep that all together. Laying it down on my towel is what I have here. Not putting it on the bare table. And I'm trying to keep the seppa and the tsuba in order. This habaki should slide off a little bit easier. Here. And I'll try to show you the stamps here. That, I believe, is a Gifu stamp, meaning from the province and army factory. This is the date. It should be straight up like this, but I also don't want to hit the stupid lamp. So this is straight up. This is the date. This is the signature. And that's the star stamp. Again, this star stamp is confidently stamped. It's not a fake. And there are also stamps along the back. Again, I think so it's one Gifu stamp. And sometimes there's also painted characters on the tang, which there are here. It's, as you can see, it's kind of worn away. But those are, I believe, assembly marks. But and on the Japanese swords, you can also traditionally you can touch the tang. That's okay. Don't touch any part of the polished surface of the blade. And of course, you have to use your good judgment. Don't touch the tang if your hands are like really filthy. Why would you do that? So don't do that. So that's an example of a star stamp Gendaito. And in future videos, I'll try to make it more clear, because I have examples of these as well, what a sword tempered in oil looks like and what doesn't make that a Gendaito. And after showing these examples, I'll show those examples, and then you could better see the difference between those. So I'm going to wrap this up. And this is the scabbard probably used in the jungle, but it's not harmful to this, so things are good. And again, see, very carefully put that in. I know I've described this in other videos, but it pains me when people unsheath these like it's some sort of movie. Don't do that, especially if you paid good money or if it has a fresh polish. Be careful. And you should respect something that somebody took the time and care to make. Well, thank you so much, and like I said, I'll post future videos on other kinds of Shogato.